They cuffed him for a crime he didn't understand, and the loudest hurt was not the cold iron, but the slow, certain belief in the neighbors' faces that he had already fallen. Watch until the end to see how this incredible story unfolds, and let us know what time you're watching today. The paper felt heavier than Samuel expected. It was the weight of a thing that had seen too many hands folded and unfolded across years, carrying news that could tilt a small life. Samuel sat on the warped wooden step of his porch and let the heat of late afternoon sit on his shoulders like an old blanket. The sky over Willow Creek had the tired color of tin, flat, pale, the kind of sky that made every shadow look guilty. He smoothed the creases with fingers that trembled more from age than from cold. The tremor had a name in his head. Tremor, not fear. He preferred the names that sounded like chores. There was a pigeon on the railing, puffed up and bold, who cocked an eye and watched him as if Samuel were another stray who had come to beg. He had fed pigeons since his knees stopped forgiving him for long walks. The birds took crumbs and gave him company. When the town had crowded in on him, when neighbors found reasons to avoid his front yard, and the bright young men in clean shirts started calling him sir in ways that lacked a human voice, he had the pigeons. They did not ask for explanations. They did not watch with divided loyalties. Samuel unfolded the letter. The edges were blunt, like a coin that had been carried in a pocket, until it learned how to fit into the curve of a thigh. No return address, just his name in block letters, the sort that belonged to men who wanted to be clear and careful. Under his name, someone had written, in a lighter hand, a single sentence, "We will be by." Samuel read it twice. The second time, the words pooled into something else. A memory of footsteps on gravel, an old radio voice speaking of distant thunder, a boy named Tommy who had once disappeared into a summer without saying goodbye. He folded the letter back along the same crease, as if folding could press down the noise that lived in the words. The house smelled like coffee and lemon oil and something else Samuel could not name. Memory, maybe. He kept the radio on the counter. Though he never listened for news, the static was a friend that didn't ask questions. His kitchen was small but tidy. Chipped enamel kettle, a stack of yellowed newspapers, a Bible with its spine broken at the same page where his wife's name had been written in a soft, looping hand. Eleanor. The ink had bled at the edges like a tear. He was a veteran more by habit than by title now. The medals he had once worn to parades were wrapped in tissue and tucked into a shoebox under his bed. Sometimes he took them out and set them on the small table by the window and let the sunlight count each dent. They shimmered like coins from another language. When he slept, the march of boots and the hum of engines came to him in fragments, snatches of commands, a child's laugh far away, the wet smell of rain in a trench that had been sand and metal instead of summer soil. Waking from those dreams made his chest ache, but the ache had become part of him. Predictable, companionable. He moved through the routines he had invented since Eleanor's hands grew colder, and the house learned to breathe without another pair of lungs. He swept the porch. He boiled water. He watched the street where the bakery's bell would ring as Mrs. Alvarez opened her shop in the morning, and where boys in soccer jerseys had once chased a ball and shattered a neighbor's patience into dust. Willow Creek had shrunk around itself in the last 10 years. Shops closed. New faces drifted through and left, but the same stretch of cracked sidewalk knew where Samuel's foot would land each afternoon, as faithful as any map. A car idled down the road and stuttered to life, 2 houses over. Samuel saw it in the corner of his eye and felt the old reflex. Turn the shoulders, weigh the distance, make no sudden move. The reflex came with a history written in streetlights and sirens. He had been a quiet man by choice his whole life. When silence cost more than weeping, he learned to speak less and listen harder. He was simple, too, in the way a river is simple. It moves the same water every year, but the light on it changes with the season. He thought of his son, Michael. Michael lived 3 towns away, working nights at a factory that smelled of oil and loud machines. They spoke on Sundays when the sun allowed their phones to share a few words without being static. Samuel had raised Michael to be steady, to work till his hands knew the shape of the world. He had raised him to be a man who would not answer a call to shame with a shout. Michael had a wife now, and a small boy who liked to pull at Samuel's sleeve when he came to visit, asking for stories of dragons and soldiers. Samuel told them stories. He told them the parts that would not break anyone. He kept a calendar on the kitchen wall with big squares and neat crosses. The days he had to remember, doctor visits, the times the pension check arrived, were marked in a faded blue. The crosses protected him as much as any prayer. On the day the letter had come, the calendar was empty. That emptiness had weight. On impulse, more like habit, Samuel rose and went to the back room. He opened the drawer where he kept his uniform shirt, the one he kept for Easter parades and the town's Memorial Day. It smelled like starch and another life. He did not put on. He only touched the cloth as if the fabric itself could answer the unformed question that had lodged in his throat. Would they be by? Who were they? Mrs. Alvarez waved at him from across the street, her hands stained with flour. For a moment, Samuel considered walking over and asking her about the letter. Neighbors were still neighbors if you allowed them to be. But he imagined the conversation ending with watchful silence and the tight smile that said, "Bless your heart," a phrase that meant different things when it came out of different mouths. He folded the letter again and slid it into the Bible that lay open on the table. Between the pages, he had told himself he'd one day reread for comfort. The mailbox clattered somewhere down by the road. He thought of going to get it and felt the old muscle tighten in his calves. Instead, he sat and watched the sun change the color of the house across the way from faded white to a bruise of gold. A dog barked for a while and stopped. The pigeons preened and then hopped off the railing, a small gray cloud against the sky. Samuel's life had been a series of small, careful victories. He had kept his temper, paid his bills, mended the fence posts when they leaned. Other men in his town had taken to making decisions for him, deciding which stories were safe to tell in their presence, deciding what side of the street he might walk on when a car came by. He had learned to guard the quiet places where his dignity lived. Sometimes he felt it like a thin coin under his tongue, valuable, metallic, and small. The letter was a crack in that carefulness. It did not say who. It did not say why. It only promised arrival. Samuel had one more memory he kept folded like a photograph in his chest. A small white house with a porch swing and a woman with laughing eyes who had called him home. He repeated her name aloud, Eleanor, because names were anchors. The sound steadied him, the way posture steadied a man on a ladder. He was not brave in the way of men who sought danger. He was brave in the old-fashioned way of people who refused to let fear rearrange their days. Night softened the edges of the town like velvet being drawn across a table. Samuel put the kettle on and listened to the small sounds his house made when it settled into evening. The letter burned in his pocket like coal. He did not tell the pigeons. He did not tell the radio. He did not tell the calendar with its neat blue crosses. For reasons he could not name, he felt the shape of the next day, leaning toward him like a person about to speak. Outside, a distant siren made a long, lonely sound and faded. Samuel rinsed his cup and set it on the counter, the motion a promise that tomorrow would require the same small ceremonies. He did not yet know whether the promise in the letter was for him or for something that had been sleeping in the town's bones, waiting for the right man to wake it. He only knew that when the footsteps came, if they came, he would meet them with the same hands that had once been steady enough to lift a wounded soldier, to hold a newborn's head, to tie a shoe. Simple hands, perhaps, but hands that remembered how to keep a life from falling apart. The morning the men came, the air felt wrong in a way Samuel could not name. It was a thin wrongness, like the taste of metal at the back of the mouth before a storm. He had slept badly, dreams of rain and boots interrupting his sleep. He woke to the house breathing in the blue light of early day and the pigeons tapping at the window as if impatient to announce the world. He had meant only to go to the mailbox and fetch the day's small things. A grocery circular, a letter maybe from the pension office. The folded paper that lived in his Bible lay heavy in his pocket as if it had a life of its own. The street smelled of wet pavement and frying oil from Mrs. Alvarez's shop, and for a foolish second Samuel thought the day might be ordinary after all. Then he saw the cruiser. It sat crooked in front of the mailbox like a beetle that had lost its way. Two officers were standing under the gray sky, their caps low, their posture rehearsed. One of them, taller, broad-shouldered, kept his hand near his radio. The other, smaller and younger, watched Samuel as if measuring the distance between man and man. "Mr. Harris?" The taller officer called, using Samuel's last name like it was a label on a file. Samuel felt his chest tighten. He had been called many names in his life, but not like that in the morning light of his own street. He walked to the curb because his knees moved that way, and because his hands were steady enough to fold a blanket without thinking. He kept his voice level. "Yes, I'm Samuel Harris." He had learned to answer plainly. Plainness let fewer people invent things for you. The taller man produced a badge. He held it between thumb and finger like a coin. The badge was official and cold and made the shape of certainty. "We have a warrant to speak with you," the officer said. "There's also a hold, federal hold." The words landed in Samuel like pebbles in shallow water. He felt them ripple through his memory. A woman from across the street, Mrs. Alvarez, put her hand to her mouth. The boys who had been playing near the bakery froze mid-throw and watched. A man in a suit who kept his lawn immaculately clipped came outside and crossed his arms on his chest, his face blank. The neighborhood had always been small in the way a town keeps its secrets, but smallness also meant everyone had a front row seat when something broke. "What is this about?" Samuel asked. The officer's jaw ticked. "There's an investigation, sir. We have reason to believe you may have information. We need to take you in for questioning." "For questioning?" The word felt foreign, sharpened like a blade. Samuel thought of his time in uniform and the nights when questions made men into facts and facts into maps that sometimes led to graves. He tried to keep calm, to fold the worry into the same neat shape he folded his shirts in. "I don't understand." "I haven't." "You have a right to remain silent," the officer said. He repeated the phrase as if reading a script. "Anything you say can and will be used." He glanced down at the younger officer, who handed him a thin file. The file had Samuel's name printed on the cover, and underneath the name was a black and white photo of a younger Samuel in uniform, jaw set, and eyes sharper than Samuel felt they were today. The officer flipped the cover as if the paper might jump and bite him. "We are serving a warrant," the officer said. "Please place your hands behind your back." Hands behind his back. The motion was so precise, so small. Samuel obliged. The cold of the handcuffs bit the skin between his wrist and palm. He felt the metal like a foreign thing attached to him, like a name he had not chosen. Neighbors gathered slowly, the way a creek encourages frogs when it realizes something has landed in it. There were whispers, speculation in the voice of people who had not yet chosen their side. Someone took out a phone and pointed it at Samuel. A child began to cry at the edge of the crowd. Mrs. Alvarez's flour dusted the air around her hands as she gripped the fence. Samuel's throat worked. "What is this about?" he asked again, not because he did not know how the script ended, but because he needed the question to fill the space where fear might grow. The officer read words from the file, the letters flat and official. "We have reason to believe you are connected to a case involving stolen assets and obstruction of justice." The officer's voice had the casual tone of a man reading from a notice at town hall. "There are allegations linked to an incident from years ago. We're required to detain you for processing." He mentioned an incident from years ago. That phrase settled over Samuel like dust. He pictured a photograph in a box, a place where old things waited for new hands to open them. He thought of places he had been, men he had known, nights that had a way of erasing their edges until only shape remained. "You must be mistaken," Samuel said. "My name is Samuel Harris. I have lived here for 40 years. I have a son. I'm a veteran." The sentence was simple, a life's worth of truth in a handful of words. "You will have an opportunity to explain," the officer answered. He stepped back as another cruiser rolled up slowly, a ribbon of black and white cutting the neighborhood. The young officer kept his gaze steady and did not offer the common courtesies of a human voice. The police seemed to be efficient, their movements practiced. They wore certainty like a coat. As they guided Samuel to the cruiser, he felt the street tilt. The pigeons scattered like gray confetti. His Bible slipped from where it had been tucked at his hip and hit the pavement with a muted thud. The cover cracked open, and the folded letter, its edges blunt and familiar, slid out and lay there, half beneath the worn leather. The officer did not notice it. The crowd did. From somewhere down the block came a voice, low and urgent. "Mr. Harris." A younger man was running toward them, face flushed with effort. Michael, Samuel's son. He had seen him dozens of times with grease under his nails and the careful gait of a man who had learned to keep his back straight. Today, Michael's face broke into a dozen emotions at once. Shock, anger, a pleading that tried to form words and failed. "Dad!" Michael shouted, lunging toward the officer. "What is going on? You can't." "Sir, step back," the officer ordered, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder in a manner that made Michael recoil as if burned. "This is a matter of procedure." Michael's voice shook as he demanded answers. He reached for the file the officer held, for a look, for evidence that this was all a nightmare that could be undone if only someone would show them the mistake. He was young enough to still believe in corrections and brave enough to try. But the officer shut the file and said nothing more. He had a practiced blankness. He could point to law and paper and hold a man's hands behind his back and not allow a soul to touch the reason. The crowd murmured. Someone whispered, "What did he do?" Another asked, "Who called it in?" Samuel stood very still with his hands cuffed, the metal uncomfortable, the sun catching on its cold arc. He prayed silently, not with the roaring of psalm or shout of chorus, but with the small, wordless pleas that returned a man to himself. He thought of Eleanor's soft mouth when she used to say, "Be careful, Sam." He thought of Michael and the boy who tugged at his sleeve and loved his stories of dragons and soldiers. As the cruiser door closed and the engine rumbled, Samuel watched the letter on the pavement. It was simple white paper against gray concrete, a small thing with a heavy promise. Someone in the crowd bent to pick it up. It was Mrs. Alvarez, flower on her apron, hands trembling. She read a few words aloud in a voice that sounded more like a question than a fact. "We will be by." A car, with dark windows, idled at the corner, farther down the road than the crowd's attention. It did not belong to the town's police. For a moment, no one noticed the way it sat like a shadow. The cruiser drove off, siren quiet and embarrassed, leaving behind a hush that felt like a held breath. Michael reached out to the window and banged his hand on the glass, pounding at it as if he could break the metal and bring his father back. "Dad," he yelled. Samuel looked at him, and in that look was a whole life of careful, simple things, a crooked fence fixed, a birthday cake eaten at a kitchen table, the slow turning of seasons. He thought of trust as something brittle and strong at once. He thought of the men he had served beside and the names they'd shouted in the chaos. He thought, too, of shadows that waited for an old man to nap in the sun. When the cruiser turned the corner, the dark car at the corner stayed where it was, its engine humming like a distant insect. The town, which had once known Samuel simply as the man with pigeons and an ironed uniform kept for holiday parades, was learning a new thing. That labels could be changed with a phone call and a signature, and someone, somewhere, had decided to make that change. Michael sat on the low wall outside the bakery and folded his hands until the knuckles whitened. He had watched the cruiser disappear around the corner and felt a small, hot animal run under his ribs, a mixture of anger and an old, helpless fear. He kept thinking of the metal on his father's wrists, the way the handcuffs had bit into skin that had once steadied a rifle and later a baby's head. Samuel had always been steady. That steadiness was the thing Michael had measured his own life against. Steady hands, steady work, steady Sundays. Now steadiness looked wrong, like a coat someone else had put on him. Who did it? Michael asked Mary as she pressed the letter back into her palm, as if she could fold the words into a different shape. She had read it again and again, although it said no more than any other mouth could read. Flour dusted her apron where her hands had gripped it. There was a softness to Mary that made her a keeper of small mercies. She had seen Samuel feed the pigeons and had waved to him every morning for years. Her voice was low, squeezed with the same worry everyone else had. "I don't know," she said. "Who calls the police on Mr. Harris? Who puts a federal hold on an old man?" She glanced along the street, that long look neighbors give when they try to find who among them learned how to wield a phone like a judge's gavel. It feels like someone wanted a show. Michael's jaw worked. Someone did it on purpose. His voice had a brittle edge. He was thinking in angles: who benefits, who wants Samuel out of the way. He tried not to think of the pension checks, of the house and its thin roof. He tried not to think of how small a man could become to others once a label like suspect was stamped on him. Across the street, Ethan Cole stood by his hedges, hands in the pockets of a suit that never wrinkled. He looked like a man who managed things for a living: accounts, reputations, the neatness of public life. He had crossed his yard earlier, watched the scene, and said nothing. When Michael caught his eye, Ethan's face was unreadable, as if the police had made a clean cut between him and the possibility of empathy. Michael had no proof, only the hard coil of a suspicion that sometimes grows in sons when fathers change in ways they cannot understand. Inside the bakery, Mrs. Alvarez, Mary, made tea and set a cup near the door. "Come in," she said, more to have movement than to coax them indoors. The shop smelled of sugar and warm bread, a smell that had been the first thing Samuel promised his family on weekends when his pockets were full of coins that had smelled like the road. Michael refused at first, then followed her in because standing under the open sky had become unbearable. They sat at a small table worn by decades of elbows. Michael watched the empty chair across the street where Samuel always sat on the porch in the late afternoon, counting pigeons the way other men counted the time. His father's silence had always been its own language. Now it felt like a code he could not crack. Why would the feds be interested in him? Michael asked. It was the sort of question boys who have grown into men ask when they want a simple map for something complicated. The answer he wanted was easy: a mistake, a mix-up, a name similar to his father's. He liked easy answers because they let him sleep. Mary poured the tea and watched Michael's fingers drum on the table. He kept to himself, she said, but he was always proud of that uniform. He never spoke wrong of anyone. He helped when the church needed someone to set up chairs. He gave bread to boys who couldn't pay. "I don't see any reason at all." "You think it's a mistake?" Michael said. Mary's eyes did not sharpen into belief. "Sometimes mistakes look like a plan until you look closer." She handed him a biscuit. "You know him well?" Michael's face softened at the question. "I know his hands," he said. "I know how they shake when he's tired and how they steady when he tells a story. I know he loves his family in ways that never made lots of noise. But I also know he has things he doesn't tell me. When I was young, he'd disappear into the shed at night and come back smelling of oil and something else. I asked once and he laughed it off. Men like him keep some things inside because they think they will protect you." That last sentence landed like a small confession. Michael had carried it his whole life. The idea that the people who love you most protect you by holding back, by letting the worst of themselves go unseen so others can sleep easier. It was a kindness that could be a betrayal, Michael realized, when concealed truths hid danger. Across town, in a place where file cabinets hummed like cages, someone named Daniel Price closed a folder and called it routine. He had been the younger officer at Samuel's porch, but the precinct had its own sets of rules. When he joined the force, he believed in simple things: law, right, certainty. Now the case sat on his desk, and it felt like a knot he could not swallow. His training told him to follow protocol. His instincts told him to leave the old man alone. He had a partner who liked tidy things and an old colonel who liked clear lines. Daniel had to square the two. That night, when he went home, he found himself turning over the black and white photo in the file, the younger Samuel in uniform, and wondering at the crease of a mouth that could be both soft and hard at the same moment. What Daniel had not told anyone was the way the town's past whispered back to him. Rumors of an unsolved theft, a soldier who had vanished with more than his good name, a local businessman whose ledgers had gaps like wounds. He kept these thoughts like stones in his pocket. They felt heavy. The longer he held them, the more he believed there was a story no one in Willow Creek wanted to tell. Back at the bakery, Michael found himself speaking of his father in a voice he had used only with his son. "Dad always said a man should leave a clean name," he said. He said, "You should sleep without the worry that someone will knock on your door." But men don't always mean the same thing by a clean name. Sometimes keeping clean is about hiding. Mary reached across the table and touched his wrist. "Don't start blaming him for being private," she said. "People have secrets that aren't sins. A man can be quiet and still be good. A man can be loud and still be hollow." Her words cut through the fat of Michael's anger and left him near a different edge, fear. What if Samuel had been protecting someone else? What if Samuel himself had been kept in the dark about his own past? Fathers could be vaults, or they could be maps. Sons are left to guess which. That night, Michael went to the house the police had taken his father from. The porch light was off, and the pigeons were gone. He ran a hand over the Bible that lay where Samuel had left it and found the letter folded between the pages. He told himself he would not read it, that the words would hurt less in the morning when things were simpler. But he opened it. "We will be by," it said, as if that was a sentence that could explain everything. The words were small and flat, but Michael felt them like a warning. He sat on the porch step and let the night press around him, feeling the thinness of his control. In his sleep, he dreamed of engines and men in far places. He dreamed of a boy named Tommy from Samuel's stories, a laugh that had stopped mid-sentence, a road that bent toward something that no one in Willow Creek spoke of. When he woke, his first thought was not of a legal defense or a bail hearing. It was of the quiet things his father had left untold, a photograph, a name, a night Samuel had once refused to discuss. The absence of those answers felt like betrayal by omission. But betrayal could take many shapes, a direct knife or the slower drip of withheld truth. Michael would have to learn which he had been given. Michael did not sleep that night. The house creaked with the small noises of an old place trying to pretend it was still whole. He sat on the floor where the light from the street lamp fell through the curtains in a pale rectangle and read the ledger by the glow of his phone. The pages smelled of dust and old smoke, the ink faded but stubborn. Each line was a careful lie cramped into columns. Dates, amounts, initials. It looked like the kind of accounting a man kept when he wanted someone else's memory to hold the truth for him. He had only meant to look for something small, a clue, a mistake the police must have missed. He found more than that. On the back of a torn page, folded tight as if to hide from the light, was a photograph. A younger Samuel stood beside a younger man, both in uniforms that had seen better days. The other man's jaw was different, his hair cut in a way that time had smoothed into neatness. Someone had written on the photograph in a hurried hand, "Tommy, saved 1987. For a long time, Michael only stared. The photograph felt like a betrayal because it suggested a life he had not been given. He had known stories. Half sentences from his father that never made maps, a laugh that stopped when asked for details. He had not known about Tommy. He had not known that Samuel, the man who mended fences and told soft bedtime stories, had once been the kind of person who would hide a life inside a ledger. The ledger's entries told a rougher story. Names of companies, dates of deposits, a string of payments that circled like vultures around a single phrase for relocation/th. Samuel's careful script sometimes used initials, sometimes full names. One name occurred again and again with neat repetition, E. Cole. The amounts were not small. They were the kind of numbers that change a town. Michael's hands moved without decision, fingers trembling as if somewhere inside him a switch had been flipped. The ledger had been in the shed, hidden behind a false board under a stack of spare shingles. Samuel had kept his life's ordinary tools in that shed, a hammer with worn wood, a tin of nails, a pair of gloves stiff with old sweat. The box that held the ledger had been nailed shut and sealed with a strip of duct tape, as if Samuel himself wanted the past to be stubborn about staying closed. Mary had sat at the kitchen table while Michael read. She had put the tea down and left it untouched. Flour dust had dried in the lines of her palms like maps. When Michael showed her the photograph, she blinked and then swallowed hard. Ethan Cole, she said. The name left her like a small gasp. That boy used to run through my shop when his mother worked the counter. He used to chase coins and hide under the tables. He wasn't the same as he is now. Her voice was soft, but words like that were knives when they cut through a town's quiet. Michael had to leave before the words finished rearranging the room. He walked the few houses to Ethan Cole's neat porch with a ledger folded tight in his fist. Ethan came to the door wearing a shirt ironed so sharply it held a pretense of sunlight. His yard was perfect, his smile was measured. He had the look of a man who had learned how to keep people at the edge of trust. "Mr. Cole," Michael said, because he still tried to be polite even when his insides were on fire. He held out the photograph as if it might explain itself. Ethan's face changed at the sight, and for an instant, Michael saw the shadow of the boy behind the man. There was a small, involuntary tightening at the corner of Ethan's mouth, the quick blink a practiced evasion. "Where did you get that?" Ethan asked carefully. "From my father's shed," Michael answered. "Do you know him? That's you, isn't it? Tommy?" Ethan closed the door a breath, then opened it again a fraction. "We were kids," he said. "That's a long time ago." "You paid him," Michael said. The ledger had been a map of payments. "For a relocation." "For that's. For Thomas Harris?" Ethan's voice was a thin thing. He had never liked to use too much emotion. His life had been built on precise measures. "Listen, Michael, I don't know what you think you have. This is old. People change. I don't." "You called the police," Michael said. The words came sharper than he intended. "You put a federal hold on him. You put those cuffs on your old neighbor." Ethan's expression did not crack. It smoothed into something that looked like distance. "That's an accusation. If you have evidence, bring it to the authorities." Michael felt a cold finger run down his spine. "You don't get to tell me what's an accusation, Ethan. My father kept a ledger that has your name next to payments that made you who you are now. He protected you. He stopped because the sentence threatened to cleave his throat. He kept a boy safe, and now you put him in cuffs." Ethan's jaw tightened. The man's eyes were blue and clear and suddenly witter-sparse. "I did what I had to do," he said. "You're talking about decisions made 20 years ago. People stepped on painful things to move on. Your father, he made choices he thought were right. So did I." "So you betrayed him to keep moving on," Michael said. There was nothing measured in the accusation. For a moment, Ethan looked like a man who had been exposed to a sun that did not flatter him. "Betrayal is a loaded word," Ethan answered quietly. "You think I called the police? Someone found documents. Someone," he stopped and smoothed the front of his shirt as if it mattered. "If there are names here, if there are records, those things have to be handled through the right channels. You handled it by naming him a suspect," Michael said. "You used your money, your influence. You made sure anyone who asked about you would find nothing. You threw my father's name in front of people, so the noise would cover whatever else was under it." Ethan's face went hard. "You can't just assume things," he said. "Prove it." Michael needed someone to show him, to say the obvious that a ledger with repeated payments tied to a missing boy, the photograph labeled Tommy, saved, meant his father had done something more than steal. It meant Samuel had carried someone's life like a secret. It meant the town had rebuilt itself on that secret. The ledger had betrayed both. When Michael left Ethan's house, the night had a sharpness to it like glass. He walked back to the bakery, where Mary sat under a lamp and rubbed her hands together as if the friction might warm a certainty. She had the small, tired look of a woman who had watched too many nights end in questions. "He had the ledger," Michael said, "and the photograph. Ethan's in it. He was there." Mary bowed her head and pressed her palms to her eyes. "I never thought," she began, and the words collapsed into a small sob. "He used to bring him pies when he was little. He used to say, 'That boy will be something.'" Her voice turned brittle. "We all let the town change him. We all closed our eyes so the town could sleep. What did he have to be so afraid of?" Michael asked. Mary's fingers found the biscuit she had not eaten. She chewed slowly, thinking, "Power makes people tidy, Michael. If someone thought the past could unmake them, they might try to tidy the past first." A betrayal was not always a hand with a knife. Often it was a slow, practical arrangement. A ledger hidden here, a photograph folded there, decisions made in offices with polished wood that could not remember the faces of the children who'd vanished into silence. Michael felt as if the ground in Willow Creek had shifted under the feet of men who had believed themselves steady. The ledger had reshaped everything. Samuel's cuffs no longer looked like the end of a man who'd slipped. They looked like the first measure someone had taken to silence the wrong questions. If what the ledger said was true, his father had not been a thief. He had been a guardian keeping an ugly ledger safe from men who preferred tidy launders to messy truths. Michael understood then that the fight ahead would not be just to free a single man. It would be to pry open a town's careful seams and show the rot that had been stitched beneath the surface. And some of those stitches were held by hands he had once called neighbors. Michael slept in fits and starts, the ledger folded under his pillow like a blister ready to burst. Each time he woke, he imagined the pages open on a table, numbers and names like small knives. The house felt different with his father gone. Cups sat where they did not need to be, the kettle stayed cold on the stove, and the porch light Samuel always left on for no reason burned the same, useless yellow. The pigeons did not come the next morning. He went to the station because anger needed shape and papers needed hands that would not tremble. The front desk woman knew him by sight. He had fixed her fence once and never charged. She let him sit in a hard plastic chair and made a call. Daniel Price found him within an hour, eyes tired and a little embarrassed, like a man who had been pulled into a room where people expected answers he did not have. "You shouldn't be here," Daniel said at first. The words meant kindly. He sat across from Michael in an interrogation room that smelled of lemon cleaner and a promise of justice. The light overhead was a thin authority. "I found this," Michael said, and pushed the folded photo and a photocopy of ledger entries across the table. The paper lay flat and suddenly more dangerous than any fist. Daniel picked them up with the polite care people give things that could change lives. He read, without surprise. His work had taught him how to listen to paper. "This complicates things," he said slowly, "especially if Ethan Cole's name is on these." Michael wanted him to say the obvious, that he would open an investigation into Ethan. He wanted the world to snap into rightness because evidence had a way of telling truth. Instead, Daniel's face closed like a book. "There's a federal angle now," Daniel said. "Once the feds put a hold on someone, it becomes a different play. We don't get to handle everything here." He tapped the ledger with a finger as if the wood grain might tell him who had used it and why. "You have to be careful, Michael. This is bigger than a neighbor quarrel. Bigger." The word left a ripple of fear behind his ears. Michael thought of the dark car at the corner that had not belonged to the town police, the way it had hummed like an insect. He thought of men in suits who carried files like shields and teeth. "My father didn't steal," he said. "He protected someone." The sentence jagged into itself. "He kept something safe." Daniel frowned. If he was hiding someone, that's not the same as stealing. The man's training fought with his conscience. But if money changed hands and names were moved, people might see it differently. And people who want to stay hidden will do anything to make sure the past stays buried. The question was not only legal, it was moral. Michael felt it press against the ribs of his life. Do you pull a loose thread and risk a coat falling apart, leaving children exposed to cold? Or do you close your hand over the seam and keep pretending the coat fits? If he exposed Ethan, it might topple more than one man. It might uproot livelihoods, reputations, and the bakery's cheerful windows. It might also free his father. That night, he visited Samuel in the county holding. The building smelled of bleach and slow time. The hall lights hummed. A guard led him to a glassed room where his father sat with a paper cup and hands that trembled from cuff marks and more. Samuel's face, usually a map of steady lines, had a thinness that made Michael ache. "Son," Samuel said when Michael sat down. The voice was the same as when he called him in the morning before work, though older. You shouldn't have come. How are you? Michael asked. It was a small courtesy before the rest of the world demanded answers. I'm tired, Samuel said. He held the paper cup, like it might leak. They asked me questions. I said I remembered what I had to do. That's all. His eyes flicked to the window, then to the ceiling. They wanted names. They wanted to know where the money came from. I told them I don't remember everything. I remember saving a boy. I remember a ledger. I remember being scared. Samuel's confession landed like a stone. Why didn't you tell me? Michael asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Men keep things because they think it will protect others. Why hide it? Samuel's mouth made a small crack of a smile, the kind that had once put Michael to bed. Because I thought I could carry it, Mike. I thought if I held the past in my hands, it couldn't reach my family. I didn't want the town to hurt him or me. I didn't want anyone to get pulled into the dark. So you let the ledger be dark, Michael said, and now they pull you out and call it crime. Samuel's face went small. I kept a promise. I kept a boy safe with what I could. We did things we thought were right then, in corners where only a few lights shone. I can't change that I used what I had. I thought money would solve things. I thought a ledger would be a way to remember what we owed and who owed what back. Michael saw his father's hands shake and flinch. He thought of Samuel's steady hands holding a child, teaching him to tie laces, to spit on a worm before throwing it back. That practiced tenderness made Michael want to defend him like a parent protects a child. But there was another voice in him, the one that feared the cost of truth. Outside the glass, the fluorescent light made everything too honest. Michael realized his choice would not be a single night's work. It would mean calling witnesses, facing men like Ethan who had neat yards and neat answers. It might mean exposing people who had once been kind in ways that had kept other people quiet. Back at the bakery, Mary listened as Michael told her about the meeting with Daniel and the visit to the holding. Her hands trembled when she poured the tea. If Ethan did this to your father, she said, he has to be held accountable. But the town will fracture. People will choose sides. Michael imagined the fracture. He imagined his son's small face asking why grown men shouted and why bread shops closed their doors. He imagined his father's medals, wrapped in tissue, being dusted off and found ugly in the light. He imagined Ethan's neat life cracking like thin glass. He also thought of Tommy, if Tommy still lived, who might have been given a life because of Samuel's choices. Maybe the boy had become a man who never knew his origins. Maybe exposing it would pull a thread that would reveal reward and rescue or ruin and shame. The house felt like an answering machine of all the things unsaid. Michael's options circled him like crows. Go public and risk everything. Trust Daniel and hope the local police could handle a federal case, run to a lawyer and dig a legal defense that might take years. Each choice had a weight and a price. That night, Michael lay awake and listened for the sound of the town settling into judgment. He thought of the ledger under his pillow, of Samuel's small, stubborn smile. The ledger had opened a door. Beyond it lay a hallway with many rooms, some filled with truth, others with vultures. He had to choose which rooms to open first. The town hall smelled of old varnish and the faint, sweet dust of paper. Outside, rain began as a thin pencil line and then moved to a steady wash, so the windows breathed silver and the room gathered the sound. Michael stood near the door like a man who had been waiting for a verdict his whole life. Samuel sat at the long municipal table, shoulders small beneath his jacket, hands folded like a man steadying himself for a sermon. Mary sat to Michael's right, fingers knotted in her lap. They had been summoned for a hearing to extend Samuel's hold. Instead, the room felt like a theater where people watched a drama they had helped write. Ethan Cole arrived last, as always late and precise, as if his timing were measured by a clock only he could hear. He passed by with that clean smile and the same iron shirts. He sat on the other side of the table, two men in suits flanking him like sentries. His eyes flicked once to Michael and then slid away. He did not need to speak to make the room lean toward him. Privilege had a voice that always carried. Daniel Price was there, too, looking like a man who had been up against too many small moral storms. He had the ledger photocopies folded in his hands. For hours he had kept things at bay, papers, calls, the thin pressure of what his badge demanded. Now, the radios in the corner hummed like bees, and someone whispered that the federal people were on their way. They came in silently, 3 of them, suits dark as a late sky, badges low but certain. The lead agent moved without ceremony. She had the stillness of a woman who had learned to wait until the moment the room was ready. She set a folder on the table and opened it with the calm of someone who had read too many secrets to be surprised by another. "I'm Special Agent Grace Bennett," she said. Her voice was plain and almost kind. "We're here at the request of the United States Attorney's Office." The effect was immediate. Ethan's guard straightened. Samuel's shoulders went still in a way that reminded Michael of a man bracing for a blow. Outside, the rain tapped a faster rhythm, keeping time. Agent Bennett did not waste words. She laid out documents, bank records, wire transfers, adoption papers, a single photograph scanned and blown up until its edges were grainy but the faces were clear. She slid the large photocopy toward Ethan and left it there for everyone to see. The photograph was the one Michael had found in the ledger. Young Samuel beside a boy with a gap-toothed smile and hair too long for neatness. Someone had written on the margin years ago, "Tommy, saved 1987. The paper trembled on the table like a thing that had been held too long underwater. Agent Bennett tapped one of the adoption papers. "We traced a series of transfers tied to a local account opened in 1988. The account was funded through payments that originated from anonymous transfers labeled Relocation Fund. The chain of transfers led to accounts linked to a holding company where Mr. Cole has been a high-level executive for years." Ethan's face did not redden. He folded his hands as if folding away the sound. "This is preposterous," he said. "Those documents could be forged." "Then explain these," Agent Bennett replied, and pushed forward a sheet of paper with a brittle clip of a school record. On it was a birth name, Thomas Hayes, followed by a later enrollment under the name Thomas Cole. There were signatures, official stamps, and a thin final line, "Adopted by C. Cole, 1990. Ethan's breathing changed. His jaw flexed. The room watched the man who had once been a boy slip through a history he could not press flat. That was a long time ago," he began. "I don't know what you want from me." "What we want," Agent Bennett said, and her voice had the flatness of a hinge, "is truth." She placed another folder down, this one full of bank statements and transaction chains that wound like roots. She pointed to names that matched the ledger and to dates that matched Samuel's careful notes. Mr. Harris kept records of payments intended to relocate a child, Tommy, from an unsafe situation, she said. Those records were real. The transfers were made to accounts that ultimately benefited Mr. Cole's businesses. Some of those funds were diverted and used to purchase shares to create a financial structure that profited a small network of people. A breath left the room like a small animal. Ethan's hands trembled now. For a moment, Michael could see the boy behind the neat suit, dirty knees, a hand that once reached for bread, eyes that trusted the wrong people. "You stole from a fund," Agent Bennett said. Her voice did not rage. It was the colder heat of accusation that had been measured and tested. "You and others used the idea of relocation as cover. When Mr. Harris tried to keep a boy safe, you turned safety into profit. When the ledger threatened exposure, a call was made that resulted in Mr. Harris's arrest. We believe it was arranged to seize the ledger, clean up the trail." Ethan's face cracked as if heat had struck glass. He stood up, so suddenly the chair scraped. "You have no proof," he said, and the words were a shield that slid in a hand that had once steadied crops. Agent Bennett pushed a final packet across. The room smelled suddenly of wet paper and iron. "We have a cashier's signature. We have copies of emails sent years ago to a private account. And we have testimony from an intermediary who says he was paid to coordinate the national hold request if certain documents showed up." Daniel, who had sat with his own shame like a stone in his throat, looked up as if a weight had lifted. "That intermediary, he's cooperating," Daniel said, voice small. He came forward last week. He said he was paid to call in a federal hold and to make sure the town would see the old man in cuffs if the ledger emerged. The betrayal landed like something heavy and sharp. Mary made a sound that was half cry, half laugh. Samuel's hands found the table and trembled. Michael rose to his feet because fury had become a pulley and his legs were strings. He looked at Ethan as if he could unmake him with the force of his stare. "You, Tommy, how could you?" Michael said. His voice was raw. "You took his kindness and built a life on it, and when the ledger came back to bite, you used the law to bury it." Ethan's face went from hard to something split. For a terrible beat, he looked like a child again, the memory of being held and hidden and then taught how to hide. Tears came, and the man in the suit made no attempt to disguise them. "I did what I had to," he said. Samuel, I owe you." "You owe him the truth," Agent Bennett interrupted. "You owe him restitution. You owe this town an explanation." The room contracted into a single point of attention. Men in suits at the edge of town, people who had made tidy decisions, now felt fissures where they had stood. Ethan's defenses collapsed like a house forgotten in rain. He sat back down and covered his face with his hands as if the shame were a physical weight. Samuel, who had been silent through the reading of paper and the folding of long histories, spoke then. His voice was small but steady. "I did what I thought was right," he said. "I saved a boy. I kept a ledger so the boy would have proof if he ever asked. I never thought it would grow teeth. I never thought men would trade kindness for money." Michael moved to his father and put a hand on his shoulder, steadying him in a way Samuel had steadied him his whole life. The rain outside beat a harder rhythm. Agent Bennett closed a file and looked at them all with an almost tender severity. "We will need statements. There will be charges, but this is bigger than one arrest. This is about cleaning the places where people thought they could make safety into profit." The moral weight of that landed in the room like a bell. People shifted, some with relief, some with fear. The ledger had been a single hinge that swung out a whole room of secrets. The truth hurt, and the law would follow in its wake. As they left, the rain washed the varnished steps of the town hall in silver. Michael thought of the ledger under his pillow and the ways a life can be both shelter and cell. Samuel walked out slowly, each step measured, and for the first time in many days there was a small sort of peace in his face, not because absolution had come, but because the thing he had guarded had been recognized. Ethan's betrayal had opened a wound that the town would now have to clean. The choice that remained was not merely legal, it was moral. Who would repair the harm? Who would confess? Who would be forgiven? The questions waited, their edges sharp, and somewhere between them the rain softened like a promise that would take time to make good. The days after the town hall felt like the slow work of a hand mending a tear. Papers moved from desk to desk. Agent Bennett and her team took statements with the quiet steadiness of people who have seen too many truths change lives. Daniel came by the bakery more than once, each visit carrying an apology he never said aloud. Mary poured tea, as if every kettle might calm a new upset. The town's gossip that had once been a sharp blade dulled into conversation that sometimes sounded like repair. Samuel came home under conditions the law required, monitored visits, a promise of cooperation. He walked up his porch steps slower than before, and the pigeons, shy and territorial, fluttered back as if drawn by the shape of his patience. He kept the ledger in a small box on his kitchen table, covered now with a clean cloth. It was no longer only his burden, it had become evidence and, in a strange way, a bridge. Ethan's fall from the neat perch he had occupied was not cinematic in the way Michael had imagined. There were no dramatic arrests on the main street. Instead, there were quiet resignations, a slow leaking of contacts and contracts, and finally a court date where facts were read and paper proved to be heavier than a suit's polish. Ethan, who had once smiled like the sun in a window, sat with his head bowed and answers that sounded like lists of mistakes. He pleaded guilty to charges related to misappropriation and conspiracy. The papers named the networks that had turned the idea of rescue into a ledger of profit. The town watched as privilege was, for once, put on a scale that did not tip. In court, Ethan spoke. The voice he used surprised people because it was not the clipped, practiced cadence of the man who never wanted to be rattled. It was softer, as if he had been carved down to something smaller and truer. I was a child when Mr. Harris saved me, he said. I remember the smell of his pipe and the way he hummed songs that weren't on the radio. I remember safety. Then the world taught me how to make safety into currency. I thought I could keep both. I was wrong. I used what he gave me to make myself safe, and then I was afraid the truth would take that away. I made choices to protect myself. In doing so, I betrayed the man who saved me. I am sorry. Sorry was a small word against the damage done. The court ordered restitution, financial and public, and months of community service working with local youth programs and a foundation set up to help children in unstable homes. Ethan agreed, at the suggestion of the judge, to a series of public talks where he would speak about how systems meant to protect can be twisted into profit and how accountability must follow power. Some in town found this inadequate, others felt it was a beginning. Michael watched it all with a weariness that settled like dust on his bones. He wanted to feel triumph when Ethan's name was called, a clean victory that would sweep his father's record in a single motion. But victory was messier. Watching Ethan confess did not erase the ledger's scars. It did not bring back the quiet boy who had hidden under the bakery table. It did not make the years Samuel had carried secret into something simple and untroubled. One evening, after the judge's gavel had fallen and the papers were signed, Michael found himself on the porch with his father, the ledger box between them. The sun was soft, the kind that drapes a familiar world in forgiving light. "Did you ever want him to know?" Michael asked, touching the cloth as if it might still be warm. Samuel's hands were quieter now. He folded them in his lap and looked up at the sky where pigeons drifted like small question marks. "Yes," he said. "I hoped one day Tommy would ask, and I would have a clean story to give him." But the world didn't offer clean stories. It offered choices, and I made the one that let me sleep. I thought I was saving him from worse things. I wanted to protect him from the men who would take his childhood and call it business. Michael's throat tightened. "He betrayed you." Samuel's smile was small and sad. Betrayal comes in many clothes. Sometimes it's a knife. Sometimes it's a coin you thought was meant for good. I don't know if he thought of me when he made those choices. Maybe he did. Maybe he thought the ledger would never come home. That doesn't make it easier. The work of the months after court was uneven. The townspeople were not sudden saints. Some doors were closed for longer than others. But children began showing up at community centers where Ethan and a few contrite town leaders funded programs for kids who needed a place to feel steady. Daniel took a post closer to home and visited Samuel now, and then, bringing news about the federal investigation into the network, others beyond Willow Creek who profited from the same pattern. Mary organized baking days where the elderly and young sat at the same table, hands in flour, sharing small, honest stories. Michael grappled with how to place a betrayal he loved alongside the man who had carried it. For a while he wanted only to simplify things, good and bad, punished and pardoned. He found that reality refused such neatness. He felt a strange respect for the ledger itself, a paper thing that had been humble and fierce at once. It had protected a life and then threatened to unmake the quiet life that had sheltered the protector. It forced a town to look at the cost of silence. One night, after visiting a program where his own boy had learned to fix a bike, Michael sat with Samuel on the porch and watched the street. "Do you think you made the right choice?" he asked. It was the question his son would one day ask him, and he wanted a truthful answer. Samuel listened to the night as if it would offer counsel. "I made the choice that fit my hands at the time," he said slowly. "I did what I thought would stop harm. I also know that by holding things inside, I allowed other harms to grow. Maybe the right choice would have been different if I'd had younger hands or a braver heart. But we live in what we have, not in what we might have." Michael thought of how often the town had chosen comfort over inquiry, how often reputations had been built on the shoulders of hidden labor. He thought of Ethan, Tommy, who had been both saved and corrupted by what he received. He thought of the children in the program who did not yet know names like ledger or betrayal, They only knew a man who taught them how to fix a chain on a bicycle. Forgiveness, Michael learned, was not a single action. It was a series of small permissions to speak, to listen, to hold someone accountable, and still tend to the wounded. He felt anger ease like ice melting, leaving water that could be used. He also felt a tenderness for his father that smelled of old soap and pipe tobacco, and the way a man's hands could remember how to steady a child even when they trembled. Months later, when winter came and the pigeons piled and puffed against the cold, Samuel took the ledger out of its box. He did not need the papers as proof now. The world had seen them. He folded the ledger carefully and set it in a drawer, not because it was finished, but because it had done the work it could. He went to the community center and taught a small class how to mend a shoe, how to tell a story that could hold truth without splintering. People came, some because they wanted to learn, others because they wanted to be near a man who had done both wrong and right. In the end, the town did not become a place with no secrets. It became, slowly, a place that understood secrets cost something when kept and when sold. Samuel died years later with a piece Michael couldn't have bought, an imperfect reconciliation stitched by truth and slow deeds. At his funeral, people who had once lingered at a distance stood close. Ethan, Tommy, stood at the back with hands folded, eyes rimmed, and he did not try to make his past into a neat speech. He simply stood and let the grief be what it was. Michael kept the ledger's legacy in the work he did, helping to repair fences, literal and figurative. He told his son stories, but he told them fuller now, about boys hidden in sheds, about choices that once saved and then harmed, and about how dignity sometimes comes from admitting you were wrong. He wanted his child to learn that bravery was not only in battle, but in owning the ways you had failed and trying every day after to do better. On quiet afternoons, he would sit on the same porch his father had sat on and watch pigeons find crumbs. When the wind moved through the town, it carried the smell of bread and rain and a memory that people could be both tender and dangerous. There was no clean forgiveness, only the work of living honestly. That Michael thought might be enough. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.